Think back to a summer when you were 8 years old. It felt endless. School let out and the days stretched on forever, each one packed with something new. Now think about last summer. Where did it go? You blinked and it was gone. Somewhere between childhood and now, time changed speed. Not the clocks, not the calendar, something inside you. This isn't a feeling you imagined. It's one of the most consistent psychological patterns ever measured, and for a long time, nobody could fully explain why it happens. So, what if the answer isn't really about time at all? What if it's about you and how your brain quietly stops paying attention to your own life? Let's start with the strange part. If you ask a 5-year-old how long a year feels, they'll often tell you it feels huge, almost unbearably long. Ask a 70-year-old the same question, and they'll tell you the years blur together, sliding past before they've even settled in. The calendar hasn't changed. A year is still 365 days for both of them. So why does it feel so different? One of the oldest explanations comes from a psychologist named Robert Lemlich, who in the 1970s proposed something called the proportional theory of time perception. His idea was simple, almost embarrassingly so once you hear it. When you're 5, 1 year is 20% of your entire life. When you're 50, that same single year is only 2% of everything you've ever experienced. Mathematically, each year takes up a smaller and smaller slice of your total lived experience, so it feels smaller too. It's a clean idea. But is it the whole story? Because if it were just math, every year should feel like a smooth, gradual slide into faster and faster time. That's not quite what people report. Many people describe a specific turning point, often somewhere in their 20s or 30s, when time seems to suddenly shift gears. That doesn't sound like a steady mathematical curve. That sounds like something else is happening. Here's where the story gets more interesting. Because the truth may have less to do with how long you've been alive, and more to do with how your brain decides what counts as an experience at all. Picture yourself learning to drive for the first time. Every second demands your full attention. The mirrors, the pedals, the other cars. Your brain is working overtime, encoding an enormous amount of new information because everything is unfamiliar. Now picture yourself driving the exact same route 10 years later. You arrive at your destination and can barely remember the drive. Where did that time go? It didn't disappear, your brain simply didn't bother recording most of it. This is the piece that changes everything. Your sense of how much time has passed isn't built in the moment. It's built afterward, when your brain looks back and estimates duration based on how much new information it stored. A researcher named David Eagleman, who studies time perception at Stanford, has spent years exploring this idea. In his experiments, when people are shown something completely novel and unpredictable, their brains lay down a much denser trail of memory. And when people are later asked to estimate how long that experience lasted, the more memory-dense experiences feel longer, even if the clock says otherwise. So here's the uncomfortable part. What happens to your life once it stops being novel? Childhood is engineered for novelty, whether you realize it or not. Nearly everything is new. New words, new skin sensations, new social rules, new physical sensations, new smells, new fears, new joys, one after another every single day. Your brain, overwhelmed with unfamiliar input, is forced to record almost everything in exhausting detail. That density of memory is what later gets interpreted, in hindsight, as a summer that lasted forever. Now think about your current daily routine. Wake up, check your phone, commute the same route, sit at the same desk, eat familiar food, watch familiar shows, go to sleep, repeat. Your brain, recognizing the pattern, stops encoding most of it in detail. Why would it? Nothing here is new enough to be worth remembering. This is sometimes called the reminiscence bump, and it's one of the strangest quirks of human memory. When researchers ask elderly adults to recall memories from across their entire lives, an overwhelming number of those memories cluster around adolescence and early adulthood, roughly ages 15 to 25. Not childhood, not old age. That specific window. Why there? Because that window is packed with firsts. Your first heartbreak, your first real independence, your first job, your first apartment, your first true failure. Novel, emotionally intense, identity-shaping experiences, one after another. Your brain hoards memories from that period because it was, in a very real sense, paying the closest attention it would ever pay to being alive. After that window closes, for many people, life starts to repeat. And repetition to your brain looks a lot like nothing happened at all. But is memory the entire explanation? There's a second layer to this, and it involves something far stranger, your body's own internal stopwatch. A researcher named Peter Mangan ran a now well-known experiment where he asked people of different ages to silently count out what they believed was exactly 3 minutes without looking at a clock. Young adults were remarkably accurate, but older adults consistently overshot the mark, sometimes counting what felt like 3 minutes when nearly 3.5 real minutes had actually passed. Their internal clock, quite literally, was ticking slower than the real world around them, which means, relative to their own biological pacing, the outside world would seem to be racing ahead. Why would an internal clock slow down at all? Some researchers point to a chemical called dopamine, which appears to play a role in how your brain paces internal timing. Dopamine levels tend to decline gradually as you age. Lower dopamine has been linked in multiple studies to a subjective slowing of your internal clock. Fewer internal ticks means each real-world second gets stretched thinner across your perception, until wide stretches of actual time barely register as having occurred at all. So you have two forces working together. Memory density, shrinking as life becomes repetitive, and internal timing itself physically slowing down. Together, they don't just make time feel faster, they quietly rewrite how much of your life you'll actually remember having lived. Here's a thought experiment. Imagine two people, both 60 years old. One has spent the last 30 years on autopilot. Same job, same commute, same weekends, nothing new. The other has spent those 30 years constantly changing. New cities, new skills, unfamiliar challenges, new relationships, new failures survived. If you asked each of them to mentally reconstruct those 30 years, whose memory would feel longer, richer, more expansive? The second person's 30 years would feel, in a very real neurological sense, like more time. Not because the clock ran differently for them, because their brain built a denser record of being alive. This is where the physics comes in, and it's not the physics you might expect. This isn't about relativity or the bending of space-time near a black hole, elegant as that idea is. This is about something almost more unsettling, the physics of information itself. Physicists who study the nature of time have proposed that what we perceive as time passing may fundamentally be our brain's way of tracking change, the transition of a system from one state to another. No change, no perceivable time. A universe frozen in perfect stillness wouldn't feel like time moving slowly. It would feel like no time at all, because there'd be nothing to distinguish one moment from the next. Your brain runs on the same underlying principle. Time, for you, isn't measured by seconds ticking on a clock. It's measured by the amount of change and novelty your mind is forced to process. Fewer new states to register, fewer new memories to encode. And your perceived timeline compresses even while the actual clock keeps its steady, indifferent pace, which means the sensation of time speeding up as you age isn't really a flaw in your brain. It's a byproduct of something almost heartbreakingly practical. Your mind efficiently filtering out anything it deems familiar so it can conserve its limited capacity for the things that might actually matter. So, can you slow it back down? Not the clock, that's fixed, but your experience of it. The evidence suggests yes, and the mechanism is almost suspiciously simple: novelty, new places, unfamiliar routines, skills you haven't mastered yet, conversations with people who see the world differently than you do. Each of these forces your brain back into the dense, detail-hungry recording mode it used constantly when you were young. Researchers studying travel and memory have found that trips involving new environments are consistently remembered as feeling longer in retrospect than routine weeks spent entirely at home, even when the actual number of days was smaller. Your brain isn't measuring your life in years. It's measuring your life in moments it considered worth keeping. Which brings us back to that endless childhood summer. It didn't feel long because you were young. It felt long because you were, without realizing it, paying more attention to being alive than you may ever pay again. The slowing wasn't in the world around you. It was in how completely, how hungrily your mind was recording every second of it. So the next time a year disappears faster than you expected, the question isn't really where did the time go? The question is, what did your brain consider worth remembering? And if the honest answer is not much, that isn't a fact about aging, it's an invitation. Because somewhere between waking up tomorrow and repeating today exactly as you lived it yesterday, there's a version of this year that could still feel, decades from now, like it lasted forever. All it takes is giving your brain something it's never seen before.